broad framework for, I think, how we can approach and understand the economic crisis in South Africa, and ways of responding. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint here. Ayabonga, please tell me if that hasn't come through, or you can just nod if that's
I
all
can
okay.
see it.
Okay, excellent. So so just thinking through some of that framework for South Africa, and I've made this PowerPoint really simple, because to just try and provide some key points rather than detailed information. So the approach which I'm suggesting here is that we need to identify three key elements. What are the key risks in South Africa? What are the main objectives of our economic response, and what critical interventions do we need? It's a very simple and straightforward framework. The key risks, as I see them, is obviously we know that there's going to be a significant slowdown. Our initial estimates show a fall in up to 10% of GDP, which will threaten basically everyone in South Africa. And the three key risks are a fall in income, which relates with poverty rising, food scarcities in terms of people's access to it, and starvation, really, a really acute crisis facing people. The second is closures of businesses, which may go into bankruptcy, and the third is an onset of macroeconomic imbalances. It's important to note that these have short-term implications for now, but also long-term ones. For example, if businesses are closed now, it's not very easy in 3 months' time that they'll just reopen and everything returns to normal. So with each of these, I've just got one slide, which is about thinking through what the risks, what the objectives are, and what some of the interventions could look like. So the first risk, as I said, is a loss of income, and what we really need there is a relief to households. The ways in which we've seen this being advanced is through an increase in various grants, either the existing ones or in new grants, a guaranteeing of wage payments, as we've seen internationally in numerous countries, a payment holiday from various debts owed, rent, taxes, and this can't be voluntary at a bank's choice. It needs to be regulated. The provision of food and with that any other essential items, and an expansion in unemployment benefits, allowing for temporary claims, even for those who may not be permanently unemployed, but who lose access to income in the interim, and to extend this to the non-formally employed, whether that's informal workers, part-time, gig economy, and so on. And there have been, particularly on the unemployment side, movements, policies actually implemented in this regard, but on many of the others, whilst plans are in the works, and we'll hear about that from some of the others speaking, there's been no real significant action. The second, which I mentioned, is business closures due to bankruptcies. And what we really need to do is ensure businesses survive this period. That means a strategic deployment of funds to these businesses, which must be linked with various conditions applied. And for large and medium businesses, that preferably takes the form of government holding equity stakes, or in DFIs holding loans, which means that there's an increase in both assets and liabilities on the government's balance sheet. For small businesses, this may just mean a cash bailout. The second is a potential for targeted and temporary payment holidays, which will be regulated and not voluntary at banks or anyone else's choice, and potentially targeted and temporary tax relief. The third area is the macroeconomic imbalances, where we really see at least, but potentially more, four risks, which is a fall in aggregate demand, exchange rate depreciation, a lack of access to US dollars, and an increase in borrowing costs. The objectives, of course, are to try and mitigate these risks. On the demand side, we've already seen various measures which would try and resolve that. Our latest work, which we'll release tomorrow, using standard input-output analysis, shows that for each rand spent by government, there is a 1.6 rand GDP increase. So if we're expecting a fall in GDP of 10%, government needs to be spending 6%. And a revision of the medium-term expenditure framework and the recent budget, which put forward severe austerity cuts. The second is around the exchange rate management, and these are sort of more complex macroeconomic and monetary policy issues, which I won't unpack here in detail, but a stabilization of rand trading and a management of outflows to ensure access to US dollars. We need to engage with the US Fed, and to ensure that our borrowing costs don't soar. There's, as we've already seen, a role for the Reserve Bank in purchasing these in secondary markets, and we need to look very carefully at the management of capital outflows. So those is just a framework, I think, for thinking about the response. Of course, what we need to do following this, which we at least as an institute are underway, and others are also, which is both in costing what these measures mean, and in assessing where the revenue which is needed can be accessed, which would be obviously in a mix of taxation, borrowing, and other revenue leveraging. So what I've tried to do is just provide what I think is an outline for how we could start to think about what a response looks like. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks for that, Gilad. I'm seeing a few attendees putting their hands up, and I guess maybe people are trying to ask some questions. What's helpful is to go to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and put some of your questions there, just like Glenn and Josh have already done. So yeah, let's go to the next presentation. Sonia, who's going to be presenting on gender-sensitive economic policies in response to the COVID-19 crisis. Sarah, let me just get your, Sonia, sorry, let me get your,
oh,
there we go.
Thanks.
To go, Sonia. Cool.
Yeah, thanks for putting this webinar together and for inviting me to participate. And good afternoon to everyone on this call. I see some of my friends are here as well. Big hi to everyone. can't wait to see you and hug you all again. I want to first start by acknowledging what so many people have already highlighted about COVID-19 since its advent, both locally and all over the world. And certainly the panelists on this call have also highlighted is that the pandemic will no doubt illuminate and exacerbate the inequalities in our society. And it has disrupted the status quo to the extent that it has forced us, particularly governments, to confront the gaps and weaknesses of our economy and economic policies more broadly. So I think now would be a great time for Ramaphosa's administration to do something of real substantive value for South Africans, particularly those that survive on the margins of the economy. However, after he's announced economic measures to cushion South Africa from the effects of COVID, I couldn't help but feel a little unsettled. I do believe that this moment presents a window of opportunity for us to really shift things meaningfully for South Africans. And yet I personally felt like his address in many ways kind of invisibilized those that are in the periphery of what is deemed the formal economy. And because any effect of a macroeconomic policy will never be gender neutral, as years of conservative economics has taught us in South Africa. I think similarly, any attempt at an economic stimulus will need to be more proactive in ensuring that women and other marginalized groups are economically and socially empowered. And yet, in times of crises like the one we are faced now, efforts for gender equality are kind of jettisoned by the wayside, right? I remember distinctly towards the end of 2019, Ramaphosa addressed the nation's call for more action on gender-based violence. And it kind of feels like now that that crisis is kind of over, we have seemingly moved on to a much bigger crisis. But I think what is really missing from this analysis is that the GBV crisis is in many ways, as we know, linked with the social crisis, with the economic crisis, with the healthcare crisis. You know, these are not separate events or occurrences, but are rather a reflection of the kind of destructive neoliberal policies and of course the patriarchal norms that these policies enforce that are still very much rooted in our society. So I want to highlight two particularly concerning aspects of these connections or these linkages that I think the pandemic has heightened, that I think we shouldn't forget and that we should be a lot more cognizant of. The first relates to the feminization of care work in this country, which extends to healthcare. And the second relates to the physical and economic violence that women experience on a daily basis. And how this has been made so much worse by the pandemic. And of course, there are many ways that there are gendered impacts of COVID, but because of time, I'll have to focus on two. So on the first, on the feminization of care work, we all know that we have been socialized to believe that certain forms of work, particularly care work, are attributable only to women. And because of this, many women carry the burden of care work in this country. And some of you might be wondering what I'm referring to when I talk about care work. Care work is basically the work that is usually underpaid or completely unpaid that women usually undertake. And it includes all types of care work, such as childcare, elderly care, healthcare, housework, and even emotional care. And with the onset of this pandemic, we are now seeing a rise in the need for all this work that will invariably extend, especially to women, but mostly Black women, because Black women, as we know, have been subsidizing the functions of the state and arguably the wealthy for decades. And a good example, I think, is community health workers. So when the state isn't able to provide adequate healthcare, community health workers are essentially at the forefront of providing health access and services to communities that simply can't afford private healthcare. And so one of the things about the enforcement of patriarchal norms with respect to care work is that it is usually undervalued and considered unskilled. But, as we all know, that community health work is very skilled labor that serves a very specific purpose in our country, and remains very much unseen and undervalued by the state. And so the irony of all of this is that as soon as COVID kind of seeps into our townships or crowded residential areas, is it will be the nurses and community health workers who will be called to kind of directly provide healthcare services to curb the spread of the virus. And I think we should all seriously begin asking ourselves some very important questions coming out of this, like, who is the economy for? Who is it really meant to serve? And when a lockdown is purposefully set up, 2 days before or after payday, who does that benefit really? And who is making the decisions that will invariably impact women's bodies and livelihoods? And this leads me to my second point, which is about the economic and physical violence that women experience on a daily basis. I spoke briefly about gender-based violence, and I think many organizations, such as Rape Crisis, have fantastic initiatives to support potential victims of GBV during this time. But the point that I want to make is that, the violence experienced by women, particularly Black women, is also distinctly economic, right? So how will a mother who owns her own food stand in CBD be able to take care of her children when the country's under lockdown? And I don't think that the current economic measures so far adequately address this question. I think it's important to implement measures that supplement losses in income or incomeless households in general, given the size and scope of care work that is required for us to get through this crisis. And I think it's also really important to get right. And what COVID has really foregrounded for us is the importance of universal healthcare. And I think now more than ever is the right time to implement both. And just circling back on the feminization of care work, I think the pandemic has also foregrounded the need to socialize care work so that men and women basically share the burden of care work equally. And admittedly, I mean, this is far easier said than done, but given how embedded patriarchal norms are in our society, but I think now that we have, somewhat of a political will, I might be a little bit optimistic. It's particularly evident, though, I think, that austerity policies or any neoliberal agenda for that matter simply isn't working. So I think now we have an entry point somewhat into kind of dismantling certain notions and understandings about who the economy should serve that will benefit everyone. So on my last point, I think, now is the best time to begin articulating what our alternatives should be, not only during the crisis, but post COVID-19. And I think we should reprioritize our economic agenda from an attachment to neoliberalism to one that is not blind to the realities of millions in this country. Thanks.
Okay. Sonia, sorry about that. I just lost my connection for a bit. Thank you for that. I saw an email from Jayati and that she couldn't be added to the panelists. So maybe, I guess, Gilad, that's why. So I'm going to try and, I guess, respond to that and try and make you the host there so we can add Jayati. But let's move along. And Brian is next, and he's going to be speaking to the contours of the fiscal intervention. And yeah, let's keep the questions trickling in as well. Brian, let me just unmute you there. Sorry.
Good. Thank you, Gilad. Hope you can see me and hear me. Just very happy to share some thoughts. These are very, very uncomfortable times, and particularly uncomfortable because I don't know that there anybody in clear charge of event circumstances and appropriate reactions. I just don't get a sense that there's there is in fact well-informed leadership. In other words, is it? It could be a basis that we need to spend the equivalent of 6% of GDP as emergency relief for the economy to limit the damage as far as one can. So, I mean, one doesn't have that kind of confidence that somebody's actually done the numbers, or in fact that the bureaucratic machinery is capable of delivering as we might hope. And I think we're not very hopeful, are we? So it's quite clear that the government has locked down a large part of the economy, not all of it. And I'll come back to that, not all of it. I think the essential food and medical supply chains seem more or less intact. And I hope that's the case, and I'll come back to that point. Now, when you lock down the economy, what it means for those businesses is obviously, I suppose, that they get no revenue. So they have no customers, they have no revenue, they have workers, but they have no revenue. So for many of them without reserve, but even those perhaps with reserves, without revenue, they have really very limited means to make payments. So somehow you've got to provide them with the alternatives. You've got to actually deliver cash, or as they've done in Britain, pay their wages. So we don't see that happening. Or you've got to use the banks to make low or no interest rate loans, in effect grants, to these businesses to allow them to pay wages or to just survive their creditors. There again, you can suspend repayment of credit. Now, government. So you can do, and you could have planned to do these or planned to have undertaken these steps. I don't know that we had any advanced planning at all for a crisis of this magnitude. So let's come back to the government has to spend more, maybe the equivalent of an extra 6% of GDP. I think that's perhaps a good working number. It's a big number. Where does the government get that money to spend? Well, the obvious place is from the Reserve Bank, directly or indirectly. We've got to print money to fund that expenditure, and printing money in these circumstances is not. It's costless. It costs you nothing to print money, and the circumstances are entirely appropriate to that purpose, of course on a temporary basis. So you've got to print a lot of money, and the Reserve Bank's got to enter the market both to provide the banks with extra cash, which they can then utilize in appropriate ways, or it's got to support government borrowing. And I don't believe you should support it at the long end of the bond market. You can only support it at the short end. There again, involving the banks in the process, making sure there's lots of cash available to the banks and support for large issues of short-term paper, or even more simply, the government could simply run down its considerable balances at the Reserve Bank to fund the spending. It can give tax relief, that is, collect less revenue, and that's equivalent to more spending. So they'll need more money to cover the extra deficit. So all of that is a process that I think we're familiar with. They're doing it abroad. I just question whether the Reserve Bank itself knows what it's in for. Having recognized, I think, under enormous pressure in the bond market that they needed to do quantitative easing, which is money creation, they then seem to resist the notion that it was quantitative easing. It is quantitative easing. It is money creation. We will need money creation to fund this extra debt, not extra debt, extra spending. You can call it short-term debt, but basically it's money creation, and it needs to be properly recognized. Now, the one thought I had, and I shared it with Gilad when he wrote to me in the first instance about this engagement, that if you're out of the formal sector and you don't get unemployment benefits and you don't get wages paid perhaps by your employers, supported hopefully by banks and government action supporting the banks, then you could starve, because if you don't have income, you can't buy food, and if you can't buy food, you starve. So one of the initiatives I think is maybe desperately called for is to provide food. I mean, what do you need to survive for 3 weeks without any income? Well, you need food. And so one of the projects that the authorities should be undertaking, and maybe the charities that have been so generously supported should be doing, is food parcels. We need a wide distribution of essential foods to people in need. Now, food parcels. And the government should order up these food parcels through the food supply chain. So the government needs to go out and order up food, and the manufacturers of food, the processors of food, and maybe the retailers who distribute food get involved in distributing as best you can food to those who will be in need because they don't have income. I haven't seen any kind of response, the response of this kind, but I think it's essential to the purpose. You give people income if you can get it to them by government getting involved, and you give food that the government orders up from our food supply chain, which I think is in good shape. We have food processors, manufacturers, they have warehouses, they have distribution capability. You could use that to that purpose. And that would deal with, I think, some of the extremes of poverty that will manifest itself over these 3 weeks. The other chain that's vital, and again, the government can spend money on it, is of course medical supplies and the like. So those are sort of my ideas. I would share my thought that 3 weeks is about as much as this economy can take. Any notion that you can actually carry on locking down the economy is, I think, almost irresponsible. We just don't have the capacity to do it. If we had a brilliant response in the form of wage support, food support, debt support, maybe we could do it. But I think we just have to accept the consequences. Do the best we can to treat sick people the best we can. But to think that we can actually prevent additional infections and what follows with it by locking down, I think it's a price we actually can't afford. It really is too expensive. Anyway, those are a few thoughts that I throw in. Thanks, Gillard. It's done.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Just waiting for Ayabonga to
Oh, yes, just one other
take
point.
us
Let me
through
make
here.
one point. The bond market, I mean, one of our advantages is a lot of our government bonds are held by foreigners. But if foreigners sell, they want dollars. And I think that's part of the reason why the rand is as weak as it is. You can't stop them selling, then you'll never get them back again. Oh, and the point you made about assistance from the Fed, that is very open to us. The Reserve Bank owns about $13 billion worth of US treasuries. So if we needed dollars, we could borrow from the Fed. The Fed has made those facilities available to emerging market economies, including South Africa. In fact, the government balance at the Reserve Bank is of the order of 160 billion rand. The Reserve Bank owes the government a lot of cash. I can't see why the government can't run down those balances to fund some of its spending. So, sorry, that's a postscript.
Excellent, thanks. Ayabonga, are you with us still as our chair and leader? Maybe I need to, sorry, Ayabonga, I temporarily was made a host so that I could set up the live streaming, which is now happening on Facebook. I'm going to remake Ayabonga the host. Apologies for this technical glitch.
Okay, cool. I also see that Jayati's joined us on the line, and she was going to be speaking to some of the international context and, of course, some of the crises that emerging markets might be faced with. So, Jayati, welcome to you, and yeah, the floor is yours. Let me just unmute you.
Thank you, Ayabonga.
Perfect.
Great. Well, I'm sorry I joined a bit late, but I did manage to hear much of Brian's excellent presentation, and I couldn't agree more. I just want to begin by highlighting how serious the problem is. I'm sure Brian would have mentioned it, but it appears certainly like the Indian government doesn't realize, and perhaps also the South African government may not realize, the sheer challenge that it faces. We are now in a much worse place, that is to say, developing countries, emerging markets as a whole, we're in a much worse place than we were at the global financial crisis, or at any time really since, even the Great Depression. We are facing already dramatic capital outflows, something like 60% outflow in the last 1 month as a group, dramatic decline in commodity prices, 55% for minerals and energy prices and so on. Dramatic decline in most of our exports, not just quantity, but price. And so foreign exchange constraints are going to emerge very, very rapidly. Debt is going to become a huge problem. Debt servicing is going to be a very, very large problem. And so I think globally, there are some things that will have to be done for all developing countries as a group. The role of the IMF is absolutely crucial in this. I would argue, I think, Brian spoke about essentially helicopter money, and I think that's absolutely essential. But we need helicopter money globally, and we need the IMF to actually dramatically increase SDR provision. So the IMF director, Christina Georgia, mentioned that something like 1.5 trillion is the lower end of the estimates that they expect. UNCTAD has suggested that developing countries will need at least 2 trillion, along with another trillion of debt relief. So I think there are 3 things globally that all developing countries are going to require, and require very quickly. One is a dramatic increase in SDR availability. I think Brian mentioned using the US Federal Reserve swaps. Yes, but that's a second best solution. We should ideally get the money from the IMF, foreign exchange access from the IMF. Second, we need capital controls to prevent the kind of very, very dramatic changes that we have already seen. I mean, 55% in 1 month, in the month of March, 60% outflows in the month of March, at a time when even after the global financial crisis in November, December 2008, we got only about 26%. So that tells you the extreme nature of the kinds of responses we're seeing in global financial markets. Already the spreads on sovereign debt are going up very, very dramatically. And we're going to face major problems in repayment unless there is a significant debt relief that is immediately on offer. So I think globally we need all these three things. And in addition, we need to ensure that there's enough money to do the kind of public health measures that will be necessary for us to deal with the crisis. I think everyone realizes that a 3-week shutdown, which is similar to what we have in India, is not enough, that it doesn't get rid of the possibility of the spread of this virus. And furthermore, it's not even enough time to take the kinds of measures that are necessary on the public health front, ensuring adequate medical testing kits, equipment, hospital beds, health workers, and ensuring that those health workers are not just adequately protected, but adequately remunerated and with decent conditions of work and so on. This is going to change public health systems very, very sharply. I think in India, we have an extremely underfinanced and unequal public health system, but I think even in South Africa, there is a very large difference between the top end and the bottom end in terms of health providers. And typically it's the bottom end, the frontline health workers really, who are the most deprived, not just in terms of wages and working conditions, but currently in terms of the minimum protection they need, the equipment and protection that they need to deal with the crisis. So for all of that, all of us need huge amounts of external resources and internal resources. But I think countries like India and South Africa, in addition, we have to take similar measures to what Brian has been suggesting, and we can afford to take them. It is absolutely the case today that borrowing from the central bank, which is another name for monetized deficit, what people call helicopter money, we've been extending that kind of relief from the central bank to banks. We have to change that and make it from central bank to government. We have to actually enable governments to spend. This will only be inflationary if we actually do not use some of that money to ensure supplies. I think it's very important to remember, globally, this is simultaneously a demand problem and a supply problem. And it's not going to be resolved by just improving demand. And while I completely agree that a significant part of the resources has to be directed towards ensuring minimum welfare of those who are worst affected, informal workers, in India, that's 90% of our workforce, and they have been destroyed by this, self-employed and informal workers, the migrant workers, women. We need to direct a lot of our resources to ensuring that they remain viable. We need to ensure food supplies and access to food of all the most vulnerable. But in addition, we have to ensure supplies. Now that's actually easier said than done. And I believe that because governments across the world have forgotten about planning and lost the habit of planning, they don't even realize what it involves. It's not enough in India. They have taken food, medicine, and other necessities off the restricted list for transport. That's not good enough. You really must actually ensure their continued production and distribution. And production involves input-output relationships. You can't simply say we'll produce food. That requires many inputs, not just for the farmers, but also in terms of the processing and the packaging. You can't simply say we'll produce medicines. The factories that produce medicine also require various kinds of inputs. There are many backward and forward linkages. You cannot see these in isolation. And so in a way, we have to bring back planning, if only to deal with this crisis right now. It's important for governments to realize this, because otherwise we're going to face supply bottlenecks very quickly. Bottlenecks in turn will translate into sectoral inflation, shortages that could even lead to social unrest and all kinds of other problems. So it's very important to remember that government intervention today has to deal with both supply and demand. I think I'll stop here because I know there are many people who have interesting things to say.
Jayati, thank you very much for that. Let me just get my video back on. Thank you very much for that. And I'm quite happy I can see a lot of the questions trickling in. So I also saw that, Brian, you've been able to respond to some of the questions that are coming to you. So that means, I guess, folk can see some of those questions. So if it's helpful, I think for some of the more open-ended questions, if some of the participants, panelists, I should say, can see some of those questions, then please respond to them as well. Let's go to our next panelist. Jayati, thank you very much for that. Let me just go to my list. Sorry about that. Where is this? Okay, so Kate, you are up next. Let me try and unmute you. There we are. Cool, go ahead.
So I'm unmuted. Okay, so some of you may have seen an article that I did about a week ago in the Daily Maverick calling for a special COVID grant as a response to addressing the crisis in the informal sector. And the prism through which that work was done was looking at how best one could support the informal sector in a context in which many of the proposals that were rolling off as part of the response were focused on business and the small business sector. The assumption when I wrote that article was that an increase in existing grants, and in particular the child support grant, was likely and was a no-brainer in a sense. And so I put the focus on people who would fall through the cracks if such a grant, if the focus was just on increasing existing grants. And I think in this audience, people will know that despite many strengths of our social grant system, there are nevertheless many people who fall through the cracks. That includes unemployed people who don't have access to the child support grant or to other grants, but it also includes many people in the informal sector who are not usually the target of social grants because they are earning often very marginal incomes, but they're earning from the informal sector. But in this context, with the income shocks that we know will have affected the informal sector, they also seem to be part of such a target. What happened then was that there was policy interest in the approach, and a team of people were commissioned to engage further with what such a grant would look like. A critical issue was targeting. And in fact, if I can just share a screen. Is that shared? Is the screen shared?
Okay. Yes.
Okay, thanks. So in looking at how one would target a special COVID grant, the idea was if one excluded, the speed was of the essence, okay? And that meant that one couldn't do means testing. One would have to use data-driven approaches through application with an ID number and exclude people already receiving a social grant, people receiving UIF, people paying PAYE. And if you look at that group, it's a group of about, depending on the age characteristics, it's about 12 million people. So that includes people, unemployed people currently not getting a grant, and it would include the informal sector. As we were doing the work, what became apparent was that in fact, there wasn't really a discussion on increasing the child support grant, and that in terms of speed, probably one of the quickest ways of getting to the poorest segments of the informal sector would be through doing that. It's not a perfect mechanism, but some 40% of households that receive the child support grant also include a household member in the informal sector. And as you can see from this grant, it's in the poorest decile that the income loss effects would be greatest. from loss of informal sector income. And so what a team of people at Saldry, and I must thank them for their very effective and quick response, what a team of people at Saldry did was to model some of the different options. And what you can see from this is that an increase to the child support grant would rapidly and quickly provide income into households in the poorest deciles, most affected by losses from informal sector income. So that seemed like a really important component of the picture in a context in which designing a special COVID grant would have at least, if all things worked very well, a kind of two-month delay in order to be able to roll that out. So that's why the focus but the focus did shift in a way to emphasizing the importance of rapidly announcing an increase to the child support grant. And that proposal has had quite a lot of traction, including from business and other players, and hopefully that is something that will happen. In terms of just this grant, I mean, what it illustrates is how quickly the extreme poverty rate will increase for households with informal workers, and the importance of looking at other mechanisms for reaching those households. So yes, child support grant, first prize, quick, let's get it out there, but it's not enough. And if we look here at this graph, what we see is the overlap between households. So the blue is households that just get the child support grant. The red is households that would also get a special COVID grant if that was introduced, because another member of the household is in the informal sector. But the green are people who would get nothing, who are not in CSG households and who are currently in the informal, who are currently excluded from any form of grant. Ignore the top two deciles, but in South Africa, I think people will be aware, if I can just click on the slide. I mean, our median per capita income households are still poor and at risk of being pushed back into poverty right up into the 6th and 7th deciles. So when you look at this graph, the fact that a lot of the informal sector, a lot of households are dependent on the informal sector in those upper deciles shouldn't put us off. We're using the CSG to address the bottom end, but a lot of the households currently reliant on informal sector income could well be pushed back into poverty if another intervention isn't put in place. The kinds of numbers we're talking, basically, if one simply includes all the excluded at the moment, it's about 15 million. Included in that, the second group is the informal sector group. The argument that we've made is that it's extremely difficult to target the informal sector directly. And in fact, we have no mechanism to do so right now. No quick mechanism and no data-driven mechanism. We can't do means testing. We can't go out and get people to register from the informal sector in order to access the grant. But the argument is that actually that's okay. That targeting a new grant, a special COVID grant broadly, to address our current gaps in social protection would provide a stimulus, and the effect of that stimulus would be to support the informal sector, because most poor households spend in the informal sector, and the informal sector is primarily dependent on spending. And so that rather than seeing the grant as trying to supplement for loss of income, one sees the grant as having a cumulative effect for the informal sector of many poor people spending again in the informal sector. So, since some of this work has come out, there's been some debate about it and critique that it doesn't target the informal sector directly, that there's lots of leakage and so on. I wouldn't see that as leakage. I think getting money into the hands of the poor is not leakage, it's part of the purpose. And by doing so, you're providing a stimulus that is the best and most effective and quickest way of getting money into the hands of the poor. Quite a lot of work is happening on designing this grant. There isn't the fiscal space for it right now. Hopefully in a week that will change. But right now the emphasis is just on getting consensus on the child support grant, but looking at these other options in order to have a really well-developed proposal in the back pocket should the opportunity arise. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Kate. We're now going to take the next presentation from Imran, who's going to be speaking to general and labor market interventions. Imran, I can see you're already unmuted, so the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you so much, Ayabonga. So I'm drawing on two pieces that I wrote in the Daily Maverick, and also a whole kind of host of kind of other kind of work that's been happening, kind of including many meetings kind of quite late into the night about trying to kind of understand this issue and to try to make sense of what is the right thing to do. So I think I want to just make a few comments about kind of how we should understand what is happening from an economic perspective. And I think three points are kind of really important here. The first is that I think we have to kind of understand this as an economic shock that starts from the supply side. So what's kind of really unusual is that we kind of actively trying to close the economy. And that means that we kind of in space that is not normal for an economic crisis. That kind of supply side action then has implications for the demand side. And I think that kind of thinking about the problem in that way is important. I think the second point is that while we don't know how long the kind of crisis is going to last for, I think we do know it's going to end at some point. And I think that having that temporary perspective in mind is kind of really important, because it means from a sort of policy perspective, your kind of objective really should be to maintain as much of your economic infrastructure as you can, and that if you don't act soon and you don't act decisively, it means you kind of really going to undermine the kind of capacity of your economy in the long term, and you're going to kind of allow damage to kind of happen, which is going to cost a lot more than kind of acting now. I think the third dimension that is important is that you've got to think about the economic issues in kind of relationship to the health issues. So we kind of closing off the economy because we're trying to solve a health problem. And if we don't act on the economic front, then we undermine what we're trying to do on the health front, and we place people in a moral dilemma that I think we can't afford to. So you can't say to an informal woman who kind of trades in a taxi rank that we're going to close off the economy. You can't earn your income, but we're not going to do anything about it. You then put her in a dilemma where she has to decide: do I feed my family and break the lockdown, can undermine my health and kind of everyone else's, or do I starve? And I think that's a dilemma that we can't afford to kind of put someone into. So I think those three kind of broad understandings of what's going on, I think, should really inform what our policy action should be. And I think it's got to mean that you have to act, that you have to act decisively, and that you have to you've got to act to maintain and to support the kind of income that is earned in a normal economic situation. I think there's three dimensions to this that maybe are much more kind of important for South Africa for us to think about. The first is that we kind of have an economy where large numbers of South Africans are marginalized from the mainstream of the economy. And I think that means that we've got to think about the fact that if you don't act now, those levels of marginalization are going to be substantially worse than they are now when this crisis has run its course. So we have a kind of official unemployment close on 1/3 of the workforce. And if we don't do something about it now, those numbers are going to be a lot worse than they are now. I think point two on this is that and Kate's numbers give you a sense of that. The middle classes in South Africa earn such low incomes relative to what we would think of as a middle class, and that class is so fragile that I think it's kind of absolutely imperative for us to act to maintain the livelihoods of that class. If we don't, we kind of really going to undermine our longer term kind of abilities to rebuild the economy. And that point comes back to the issue I raised at the start about the temporary nature of this specific crisis and the importance to kind of link it with a longer term economic strategy. I think the third point is that we live in an economy, and I think Sonia made this point quite strongly, where kind of gender violence, kind of gendered marginalizations, a kind of really important part of how this economy operates. And if we don't act, we kind of going to accentuate all of that. And I think the case for policy makers to act decisively is kind of really key on all three of those points. I sort of guess the key kind of question, and I'll end here, is what do you do when you're in an economy that doesn't have the fiscal space that I think you would like it to have? So I think in the South African situation, we have to confront the fact that our public finances are not what we would like them to be, and that whatever you might think about the budget speech, I think we would all accept that the governments in a fiscally constrained space. So the kind of challenge for policy makers is, well, what do you do in a crisis like that when you don't have the fiscal space? And I think the only option that's come open to you is that you have to create the fiscal space. And I think the points that kind of Brian and kind of Jayati have raised about the kind of link between fiscal policy and monetary policy are kind of really, really important. So kind of central banks keep large foreign reserves for kind of emergency situations. And I can't see how you can come to the view that we're not in an emergency that we're not in an emergency situation. And I think that means that our policy makers really have to work hard to create the fiscal space that we need for the action, for kind of actions that we have to take. Because if we don't do that, it's not the case that these costs are not going to have to be paid. We're going to have to pay a lot more down the line. And I think thinking about the issue in terms of this time horizon, in terms of the time horizon, is really, really kind of really, really important. My last point on the financing is I think a group that we kind of really have to hold that we really have to hold to account is the international financial institutions. Kind of Jayati made this point, but I think it's worth emphasizing that I think both the IMF and the World Bank have been much too slow and much too silent on kind of on this issue, and I think it's kind of really important for our governments and for civil society to kind of start to raise that issue. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, there we are. Thanks for that, Prof. Let's now hear from Fiona on the industrial policy dimensions here and how industrial policy can be brought in to respond to the crisis. Fiona, let me just unmute you. Oh, yes. Please go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Ayawong and all. So the starting point of my comments is that industrial capacity, which is lost through this crisis, is unlikely ever to be regained. So where workers lose their jobs or firms close associated with the current conditions, even when those conditions that brought those about change, given the nature of the South African economy, there's unlikely to be an automatic bouncing back. So unless we have really strong interventions, it's actually going to put the economy on a different and worse structural path. So we'll have like an upward shift in structural unemployment and so on that we may never recover from. So I guess it links up with some of Gila's initial comments, and it's really a no-brainer case for really strong and expansive interventions. So I want to make a few specific comments about specific industrial policy interventions in the domain of the production of essential medical goods. So I think in terms of the ramping up of industrial production of the medical supplies which are most urgently needed. As far as I can see, in particular here is ventilators for patients, respirators for healthcare workers, personal protective equipment, including gloves, masks, goggles, face shields, gowns, aprons, and so on, sanitizers and disinfectants, testing material, equipment and systems, pharmaceutical products for the treatment of those ill with coronavirus symptoms, and then when a vaccine hopefully becomes available, the mass production of that vaccine. So I think yeah, there can be a couple of legs towards the ramping up of production of these supplies. So one is dramatic expansion of production through existing suppliers. So for example, in the pharmaceutical sector, the medical equipment and medical technology sector, and so on. And then secondly, and given the extent and urgency of the needs, the repurposing of industrial capacity. So I wanted to make a few specific comments around that. I mean, one is around in the production of sanitizers and disinfectants. The obvious types of manufacturers to repurpose there are in the chemical sector, the cosmetics
Hi, Fiona. I seem to have lost you on my end. Hello?
Ayabonga, it seems like we may have lost Fiona. I'm trying to see what's going on. She may have lost her audio. Whilst I try and contact her, do you want to move on either to whoever's next, or if we're done, to any of
So we're
the...
done. And I guess maybe there's some interesting questions that are coming through. And I've tried to order some of them. I know some of the panelists have already answered some of them. So I'll try not to duplicate any of those. And maybe, I guess, Sonia, let me start off with you. I think there was a few questions posed in your direction that maybe you can answer. I see Gilad's responded to some of the ones directed at him. But the one from Funzani was, she felt that the gender question as it relates to economic policy in South Africa always feels like a subject that's dealt with as an afterthought. How do you think gender and sexuality can be dealt with differently as an integral part of economic policy making? So maybe let's start there. And then we'll, once we get that response, go to some of the questions directed at Brian.
Sonia, you should be able to unmute yourself. Ayabonga, I'm not sure why Sonia's having difficulty unmuting.
Okay.
Do you want to ask another one in the interim?
Okay, so there were a lot of questions directed to Brian. I know he's tried to answer some of them. I think there were questions around the reserves. From Stan, one of the questions was, what would the impact of crediting Treasury with at least 600 billion on the value of the Rand? What effects would these involve? And I know Jayati's also responded to some of these questions. But I guess for the purposes of everybody on the call who might not see the responses, what are some of the implications there, Brian, for you know, the helicopter drop of money from an inflation perspective? And I guess the other question is, of course,
they're asking questions now.
Okay, Sonia? Okay, I see Fiona's back. So maybe, Sonia, if you can just pencil in some of the questions I've posed, and Brian as well, and then we'll allow Fiona to complete her input. Fiona, we lost you there for a second.
Yeah, sorry, my computer just crashed for no reason. I'm back. Sorry about that. Bad timing. Yeah, so I was talking about the repurposing of industrial capacity, the auto sector for respirators, the clothing and textile sector for, the auto sector for ventilators, the clothing and textile sector for respirators and personal protective equipment, gloves, masks, gowns, aprons, and so on. And we can also assess what can be done directly through state-owned enterprises. And then, depending on how the crisis unfolds and its longevity, there might be a need for new producers, but I think it's very difficult to set up new producers during this period. So obviously the preferred options are ramping up of existing production and repurposing of capacity. Then I wanted to raise some related issues around the industrial production of medical essentials. One is that during the ongoing industrial production of essential goods during lockdown, there's clearly a need for medical precautions to minimize the risk to workers and their families while the rest of us are safely at home. We also need recognition of essential services all the way along the value chain in the production of essential goods to avoid bottlenecks. More broadly, yeah, I really agree with this call, which has been put for kind of a war footing in terms of the industrial production of essential goods, medical goods in particular, given the scale, the importance, and the urgency. And even if we can successfully flatten the curve in South Africa, and in the best case scenario, we don't need all of the goods which have been produced in the best case scenario, those goods will definitely be needed elsewhere, including in the rest of
We seem to have lost Fiona again. Ayabonga?
Okay, so Sonia, the question, I see you sent a message there about the question. So there were two questions that were directed at you, one from Jane, and it was about the point you had made around socializing care work. And she sees a role in the provision, preparation, distribution of food for universities and some of the existing infrastructure there, using university residences for kitchens and, the university kitchens and dining halls for that purpose. And she just wanted to hear some of your views on that. And then Funzani was asking, how do we make sure that the gender question in economic policy in South Africa isn't seen as an afterthought, but is really seen as an integral part of economic policy making? So let's maybe get responses to those two questions. And I know Brian is off the line, but he's been able to respond to some of the questions. And then thereafter we'll go to Jayati.
Sonia, are you with us? You would need to unmute.
Oh, I thought
There we go.
Mute me. Thanks. Yeah, on Jane's point, I definitely agree with her. I think a feminist response to the COVID-19 would definitely be ensuring food sovereignty. So yeah, I really agree with her points, and if she can share us any of her website or any information on what she was referring to, that would be great so that we can share it. On the other question, I think, yeah, I also completely agree. I think, you know, in a country where more than half of the young people are unemployed, where there's a huge working population, you know, where there is a formidable so-called informal economy, you know, the list goes on. This should really be our point of departure when thinking about, you know, a framework for our economy. So as you know, our economy was in shambles before COVID. So I think we really need a rethink of this deep structures that allow for extra vulnerability in times of unexpected external stresses. That's it.
Okay, thanks for that, Sonia. Jayati, there were a few questions that were posed to you, and I've also seen on the Q&A that you've been able to respond to many of them. I guess a lot of them, one, for the purposes of some of those who might not have seen that, is around issues of migrant informal labor, both in India and in South Africa. How do we make sure that financial help and relief is able to reach these vulnerable groups? And then there was an interesting question from Isaiah about which one is better between IMF relief or even prescribed assets, and what are some of the trade-offs involved with that?
Hello?
Hi, Jayati.
Hi. Yes.
I don't know.
Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you. Did you manage to hear the questions?
Okay. Yes, I did. Thanks. So I did put a brief answer right into the chat, but rural areas who have come and are forced to desperately try and get home and are being denied that opportunity, but really have nowhere to live or go, because many migrants, they get a place to live along with their jobs. So we have been treating them very badly, but there is a possibility of doing much better. And that what some of us have suggested, a set of proposals that we have sent to central and state governments, includes provision of free food rations. We have a kind of extensive public distribution system that actually caters to about 70% of the population. So free food rations of basic food, grain, basic pulses, soap, sugar, cooking oil, and so on for 3 months, and a cash transfer to these people. Not just those who are registered with the food security, but basically there are many overlapping groups. Those who are registered with our employment guarantee in the rural areas, those who receive public pensions, these are people below the poverty line, and a range of others who are beneficiaries of schemes. Those schemes are usually defined in terms of need. And I'm pretty sure in South Africa, you would have similar schemes. You basically take a list of all of those people and ensure cash transfers for 3 months, along with provision of food, if possible. And that's essential, because otherwise you're talking about sheer survival. we are talking about a complete cessation of economic activity, which is unprecedented. So when it's unprecedented, you have to actually also take unprecedented measures. The issue of how much will it cost and can we afford it, these are irrelevant questions. I think the point has been made over and over again that you can actually simply borrow from the central bank and do these kinds of measures immediately. But I also emphasize, and I think Fiona mentioned that as well, the whole need to ensure continued production and distribution. A focus on supply, which our governments have forgotten about because they really gave up on planning for a while. That has to come back big time. There has to be public organization of production and distribution for essentials. On the issue of the IMF, yeah, sure, the IMF has a terrible track record and it's been disastrous pretty much all the time. Unfortunately, right now, we don't have a choice. We don't have the time to sit around and make another institution. We really have to deal with what we have. This is a global challenge. It has to be dealt with by a global body. The IMF has the capacity. It contains within its own articles of agreement the possibility of issuing special drawing rights, which are global liquidity, which can become foreign exchange. So what we are proposing is really a doubling of those. In other words, 1 trillion increase in special drawing rights to be made available to countries according to their quotas. But many of us would argue that, in fact, developing countries should get double their quotas, which is the proposal Keynes had made for the IMF way back in the 1940s. So a massive increase in quotas. Now, remember, quota money or SDR money coming from quota comes without conditionality. And that's a very big thing. So you're actually providing global liquidity. Is this going to lead to global inflation? No. Hey, we have just had the biggest increase in global liquidity over the past 10 years since the global financial crisis without any inflation. Right now, inflation will come from shortages, from supply bottlenecks, and it will be cost push inflation. So the point really is to deal with those. Is IMF better than other means? Yes. I mean, US Federal Reserve swaps, okay, second best option, and it's limited. It's not that large. It's not sufficient really. And not all emerging markets and developing countries can access them. Borrowing from global bond markets, I would say this is not the right time in any case because it's harder and harder. Yields are rising, bond prices are falling. It's going to be harder for all developing country sovereigns to access debt of that kind. So this is really something all of us should push for big time. What happens if we don't get it? Here, I would say, yeah, foreign exchange is a constraint. So you really have to think about how you're going to conserve your foreign exchange, but institute capital controls immediately to prevent more bleeding. Put in place measures that will not allow the kind of capital flight that has already occurred in the last month. Do some import rationing so that you're focusing on necessities and use helicopter money internally. Thanks.
Jayati, thanks a lot, Jayati, for that. I know Fiona is back, and I guess it's a perfect segue from that conversation on the supply side dynamics. Fiona, I certainly hope the computer's not going to crash this time around.
Yeah, there's some sabotage going on here. I don't know. Okay, anyway, sorry about all of that. Yeah, so I was just talking about the need for quick interventions because of the greater lag in this domain specifically between, for example, taking an action on ventilators and those actually being available in hospital wards. And when necessary, government should really not be shy from taking control of private sector capacity directly. And obviously this is seen as much more legitimate during this period than usual. I mean, we've seen Trump's directive to GM and so on. Then more broadly, there's a need for supportive fiscal and monetary policy, and in particular, I would say supplementary budget and reversal of the cuts that were announced in the budget, the February budget. Otherwise, these are just going to undermine any industrial policy measures. Yeah, then hopefully mass testing, which is now being rolled out, will allow for the sequential reopening of sections of the economy, probably phased geographically, and most likely, I would imagine, starting outside of the metros and in particular outside of Gauteng, KZN, and Western Cape. So there will be a need for phased reopening of broader industrial capacity within that. In terms of incentives and support measures which are needed during this period, I would really encourage that these be as simple as possible in design and implementation, because there's obviously diminished capacity from both the public sector and the private sector during this period. So, in a kind of trade-off between simplicity and sophistication and nuance.
Oops, we seem to have lost Fiona again.
Real pity.
As
yeah, so I think let's move along. There's a few questions that are coming through for Kate. And Kate, a big chunk of the questions are really about the increases to the child support grants. Janet asking, should these be administered by the DSD or through the municipalities, which have already identified poor households, I assume, through their indigent policies? And then, let me just go back to my list here. There were a few others. T-sets are asking, would it be more beneficial to establish a special COVID grant or allow informal traders to operate? And a lot of the questions also centering around whether or not the kind of relief we should be extending is just by allowing informal traders to operate. And then Leonie saying, different panelists have emphasized the comparative benefits of cash versus in-kind food support in meeting the needs. How appropriate are these responses as we move from a labor supply crisis to a deepened labor demand crisis?
Okay, so I mean, an increase to the child support grant basically means changing one formula in a cell. It is very simple to execute because the systems for the child support grant are all in place. So in terms of Fiona's point about simplicity, it is one of the simplest ways of getting money out, quite well targeted to the poor with a strong gender component. So from those perspectives, I think that is a bit of a no-brainer. The point about whether a special COVID grant or whether just allowing the informal sector to operate, I hope people saw on the chat that I clarified this morning. New regulations have been gazetted that allow the informal sector to operate, particularly in the food sector. So no registration required. It includes street traders. A whole team of people have been working night and day on this to lift the restrictions on the informal sector. So, but the assumption of a special COVID grant is that trickle-up mechanism, if it's a stimulus that is in the hands of poor consumers to act as a stimulus for the informal sector, it does assume the informal sector can operate. But just to clarify as well, we need to periodize what is needed. Right now, the need is for people to put food on the table, and something like the child support grant is the quickest, best way of doing that in the lockdown. It will take us at least a month or two to set a new grant in place. And by then, perhaps not, but ideally, economic activity is starting to re-emerge. So that kind of a grant would be as much a stimulus to renewed economic activity and helping the informal sector get back on their feet after the lockdown. And I think given the poverty impacts of this crisis, there's no problem with an approach that sees a staggered effect of stimulus. So you start with the child support grant that has a particular effect. It's targeted at the poorest. You complement that with a special COVID grant that kicks in maybe 2 months later, but also helps address the poverty impacts of the crisis.
Thanks for that, Kate. Do we have Fiona back? It's a real pity that... let me just check. Do you have Fiona back?
I don't think so, Ayabonga, but no, it appears not.
Okay. Gilad, there was a question for you here, and I don't know if you had a chance to answer it, from Josh, who was asking how this 10% of GDP figure had been constructed and whether or not it was possible to accurately estimate this in this context now with where statistical collection might be affected by the lockdown measures.
Yeah, thanks very much. I don't think it is possible to collect this in any kind of sort of scientifically rigorous way. I think what we can do is use various rules of thumbs and estimation techniques. So I'll go through those quickly. For example, we can look at the impact which the global financial crisis had on GDP, and then look at estimates which compare this with that. There's various indices which we can analyze, for example, manufacturing output, capacity utilization, and we can look at this not only in South Africa, but in emerging markets as a whole. UNCTAD, for instance, has implied that their view is that the crisis will have twice as large an impact on emerging markets now as it did at the time of the financial crisis. And the impact of the financial crisis was around 5% of our GDP. We can also look at the various time periods in which lockdown and slowdowns are occurring in our country and use that to estimate. One can look at the South African input-output tables, which essentially show how each sector of the economy impacts on every other sector, and try and estimate from those what a reduction in economic activity in a particular sector means. So, in a range of ways, there's various attempts to estimate what the impact might be, including, for instance, I should have added, through an estimation in a loss of incomes and in wages. And so we're undertaking a range of those various types of estimations to get a picture. But I don't think we are going to be able to, at the moment, be able to sort of say with great certainty. But that obviously can't allow us to not act in the interim, and we shouldn't look for scientific, we shouldn't look for exact answers where those might not be statistically available yet.
Okay, thanks for that, Gilad. I've got a question here from Lutendo. It's for you, Fiona, and I hope you're back on the line. It says, do you think immediate relief should be offered to manufacturing sectors that were already struggling prior to the pandemic? What sort of relief, and how should we prioritize the different manufacturing subsectors?
Okay, I can't actually see the question, but yes, I mean, I think it's obvious that it's clear that there should be that kind of relief, and I mean, some of those measures are already put in place by government. I mean, there's the TERS benefit scheme and so on, which I guess is not sectorally targeted. I mean, I would imagine that the most pressing thing is around industrial production for medical needs. But clearly that has to go in parallel with the retention of the capacity which is there, and ensuring that that is not run down. Maybe while I'm on the line, let me just make one additional final point, which is that we also need to look in the support measures which are being put into place for how can we use this to reconstruct and rebuild the economy going forward post lockdown in a way that promotes the kind of desirable goals that we would have wanted to advance: the structural transformation of the economy, the shift to green industrial policy and a just transition, and so on. So it can't just be a rebuilding of the same and going back to normal. And the fact that the state is playing a more leading role than usual in this actually presents a chance for doing some of those things.
Okay, thanks for that, Fiona. I've just got a last question just as we wrap up, and I know we couldn't be able to deal with all of the questions, but Imran, maybe this one is for you, and it has to do with the comment that Kate was making towards the end about relaxing some of the regulations for informal traders, and how that would link alongside maybe the COVID grant and even an increase in CSG. Are there complementarities between those two courses of action, deciding to relax some of the regulations and also increasing the CSG and potentially considering a COVID grant for vulnerable parts of our population who might not be covered by other grants?
Hi, Ayabonga. Sorry, I was trying to unmute. I think that those two strategies go hand in hand. I think it's interesting to just think about how our policy makers think about the informal economy. I mean, we kept open kind of formal parts of our kind of food and basic distribution system, but for some kind of reason that I can't understand, we didn't to start with allow the kind of informal parts of that distribution system to kind of operate as it normally does. So I'm quite pleased to hear that the kind of regulations have been amended, and I think it makes the possibilities for the types of measures that Kate has been talking about a lot more effective than they would otherwise have been. So I think they do go hand in hand. Having said that, I think we need to be. So I'd like to look at the regulations, but I should just raise another caution about the health kind of challenges that go with that decision, and the imperative to kind of ensure that the kind of objective of kind of flattening the curve is built into the way we've kind of thought about the regulations. I haven't seen the regulation. I don't fully understand how it's going to work, so I can't say much more on that question. I'll stop there, Ayabonga.
Okay, yeah, there we are. So folks, I think we're gonna have to wrap it up there. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. And Gilad, maybe, I don't know if you want to say a few more words just about next steps and maybe whether or not we might need a follow-up to this conversation. I think there's a lot of questions that have gone unanswered. I think there would be a lot of people who would also want some follow-up. I know this session is recorded, and so many other people might also have follow-up questions on viewing this. So maybe if you could just briefly say for the next few minutes or so what potentially you were thinking the next steps would be, and then we can maybe offline much of that conversation.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much. As the host organization at the Institute, a big thanks to Ayabonga for so competently moderating this, and to all of the speakers. We will be making the video live. We are interested and would like to host a follow-up session next week, which we'll be engaging with various presenters, both those here and others on. The Institute, just from our side, is also undertaking other work. We were involved in an open letter from economists, which now has more than 250 signatures, which is available on our website. We've produced a research note about a week and a half ago, and are in the process of producing a follow-up one, which looks at issues of costing and of implementation, which of course were not addressed either in the first research note or in the open letter. We would be very happy to hear from anyone in attendance about what people are interested in and what sort of engagements. You can reach us on info@iej.org.za. So from me, that's it. Ayabonga. People can sign up to our mailing list on our website, which is also iej.org.za, and that way you can be kept abreast of the next webinars and of various research outputs. We will once again share with everyone the articles which our various panelists have published previously, and thank them for the input which they've offered here.
Okay, cool, guys. That's it, folks. Thank you very much to everybody. Thanks to the panelists, and thank you to our attendees. We started off with about just over 100. There's about 82 of us now, and I hope there's many more others who are watching on Facebook. Cheers, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks.